It's the NUFC Monday Show. On today's episode, we're going to be looking back at Eddie Howe's press conference from the whole game, particularly comments on Miguel Almiron, shock links with the Championship striker, and assessing where Newcastle are ahead of the season as they head to Japan. Let's get into it. Hello, good afternoon and welcome to the NUFC Monday Show. Lots to talk about. I'm hoping to do a live show on Wednesday. Please join me at 5 o'clock on Wednesday. I'll put a community note as well. I'll put it on Twitter. I'll advertise as much as I can. Wednesday for a transfer chat, a live chat. I'd love to get your questions. I'd love to have some interaction with you. 5 o'clock on Wednesday, live on YouTube. Lots to unpack. Obviously, Newcastle have played their very first pre-season game. I was there at Hull City during the weekend. I spoke to Chris Watt from The Athletic. I'll leave the video link in the description below because it was a really, really good watch. Really good to speak to Chris, get a bit of insight from his perspective on the current goings on in Newcastle. He was in Germany for the press conference that we all exploded everything for Eddie Howe and the whole situation with Newcastle and the possible links with the England job and Paul Mitchell, all that sort of discourse that came from that press conference. He was there, so it was great to get his insight on that. Newcastle have now jetted off to Japan. They've landed in Tokyo this morning. They've got a couple of games this week and then they come back for the Seller Cup. Eddie Howe spoke about what he wanted to get out of the trip. He said there won't be too much time for training. They'll just be focused on the match. It's about ramping up match minutes. Players like Joe Willock, Sean Longstaff, who didn't play in the Hull game, will hopefully get minutes in the two games there before the Seller Cup. Willock, we discussed on the video with Chris and his situation. Obviously, he's been injured pretty much for a year now, if not more. And there's a little bit of concern about managing his fitness. And I think that's really what sort of played into the sort of caution around him, is trying to get him right. Howe did say, though, that he is looking like he could be in the best shape that he's been in for a long, long time, which is great to hear. Obviously, we've got a lot to discuss in terms of transfer rumours, as well as been links, as I mentioned at the top of the show, to a Championship striker over the weekend. Newcastle are expecting to make a bit of a breakthrough in the transfer market in Japan, which is great to hear. I think we'll start with the discourse around Miguel Almiron. Now, there's been a lot of reaction to what he said when he was asked in that press conference about Almiron's future. Obviously, Almiron's just come back from the Copa America, late arrival with Fabian Schär as an international player. Wasn't involved against Hull because he'd only just come back at the end of last week. He has travelled, obviously, to Japan and will probably feature this week. There's lots of questions about his future. Obviously, we know that Saudi Arabian clubs have been linked and are interested. I've spoken to people close to Almiron. There's also interest from Spain. He's been linked with a couple of English clubs too. So I think that there's ample suggestion that he will move, and a lot of people have misinterpreted what Eddie Howe said in his press conference about Almiron. He was asked directly if he would like to keep him, and I've got the verbatim quotes right here. I was sat about 2 feet away from him when he said them, and this is exactly what he said. Miggy has been unbelievable for Newcastle long before I came, but also since I've been here. He has been a pivotal player, a key player. We love him, we love his personality, we love working with him. He's come back with a big smile on his face. I'm looking forward to working with him again. He was asked directly to comment on whether he would like to keep him at the club this summer, and he didn't do that. I think that's very telling. The way that people need to understand that how Eddie Howe's press conferences work, it's more about it's as much about what he doesn't say or the tone of how he says it than it is about what he does say. And he was very complimentary about Almiron. He was very complimentary about his personality and the way he is around the training ground. And obviously, we know how much of an infectious character he is, and he always has been. He was also very complimentary about what he has done before he came and while Eddie Howe's been here, and he has been a pivotal player for Newcastle. He had that purple patch in that season when Newcastle finished in the top 4. He got 11 goals, which was sort of distorted his stats, and I appreciate that his stats haven't been particularly good, and I appreciate there's an appetite to see Newcastle move on from Miguel Almiron, but there's nothing in there that Eddie Howe has said that suggests that he will not leave this summer. He's not going to say that he's going to go now because there isn't anything close. He said that generally about transfers in and out earlier in the press conference. He's not going to say that Almiron isn't part of his plans, isn't good enough. He's not going to throw his player under the bus like that. That's not the way Eddie Howe works, but also it's not how any manager works until something is close. And we saw with Harvey Barnes last summer, who was sat in America ready to be announced as a player, that Eddie Howe is not going to be truthful to the press when things don't suit him. I don't think there's anything in that to suggest that he will be a key player going forward. He didn't say that. He said he's been a key player. He spoke in the past tense. He didn't answer the question because he was asked, would he like to keep Miguel Almiron, and he didn't say yes or no. And I think if he liked to keep him, he would have said yes, because that's previously the way he's spoken about players that he does want to keep. He's openly said that he needs to build a team around Bruno or Isak, for example. He's not said that about Almiron, and I think that is quite telling. I would tell people not to panic about the way that Eddie Howe has spoken about Miguel Almiron. I don't think he's going to be a very key player going forward, but it's absolutely true that he has been for Newcastle over the last 5 years. He's really worked hard for the club. There's been players who've taken Newcastle for a ride over the last 20 to 30 years. He isn't one of them. He's given his absolute all. That is something that deserves a lot of credit. He's a very popular player in and outside of the club, and I think he deserves that appraisal from Eddie Howe. But again, I've seen a lot of people getting frustrated with Howe, saying that he's going to be a key player going forward. He hasn't said that. What he said is very much what you would expect him to say at this stage, when nothing is close to an exit. There's no need to sell him anytime soon. Newcastle have a solid budget without the aid of sales to begin with to get the players that they need. But I do think that Almiron's time is coming to an end. I agree that Almiron has served his purpose for Newcastle, but I absolutely don't understand the panic and the frustration about what Eddie Howe has said, because he's not going to say anything different. And as I say, everything about Eddie Howe suggests that it's about what he doesn't say or the way he says things, rather than taking what he says verbatim, as I've just given you the quotes as exactly as I have them recorded on my phone to what he said. And also, there's a lot of hate that Miguel Almiron gets, but I don't understand, because as I say, there's players who've taken Newcastle for a ride for a long time. There's players who've given a lot less than he has, a lot less service. And you know, we've Newcastle fans have been here where they've said we want a team that tries, we don't demand a team that wins. And that's he encompasses that. He isn't the best player that Newcastle have ever had. He's not had the best output that Newcastle have ever had, but he's always given his best, and he's never shirked. He's always put a smile on his face. He's always got up and gone again. He's always been more or less available whenever he's been needed. He's been very, very rarely long-term injured, and I think that's a big thing for him as well. So he deserves a lot of credit, and he will leave, I think, this summer, and he should do so with his head held high. But I don't think anyone should really panic about what Eddie Howe said about this, because he isn't going to say anything else, quite frankly. On to the first rumour that we've got today, and the first one is Will Osula from Sheffield United. It appeared over the weekend from Alan Nixon, who said that Newcastle have got an interest in a deal of between £8 and £10 million for the 20-year-old striker. 21 games in the Premier League last season, no goals, and I can understand, I can almost hear the Newcastle fans getting frustrated with this link to a striker that isn't proven, isn't going to make an impact at Newcastle. But actually, I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. I think that there's if this is true, I think the logic is that he is very much the archetypal idea of a third striker to play behind Wilson and Isak. Talking about the issues of persuading a top striker or a striker who can make a difference immediately to come and play, even if Wilson goes behind Isak. Whereas Osula is somebody who's 20. He's got a lot of... I've watched him a lot because I've watched Sheffield United a lot last season. I'll get into his game in a second, but he's 20. He's physical. He's got a lot of attributes that make him mouldable and worth developing. And I think as a third option behind Wilson or another and Isak, it kind of fits. I think it's very harsh to judge him on his stats, because he played in the Sheffield United team his first full season as a professional player in the Premier League. At 20 years old, playing 21 games, no goals, in a team that scored 35 all season and was one of the worst teams ever to play in the Premier League. They played 4-5-1. They didn't really give their attack a chance. It was all about damage limitation pretty much from the start. And believe me, I've watched a lot of Sheffield United last season. I saw that happen. But I also saw a player in Osula who was physical, he was quick. He's got everything you'd need to be a complete striker one day. And someone like Eddie Howe could really work his magic there in the role of the third striker. The pressure wouldn't be on him. He could develop, he could learn from Isak and Wilson. There's no two better strikers to learn from in that sense. And also, I think he could come on quite quickly. And if you look at the reaction from Sheffield United fans, even at this idea that they would sell Osula, it's been pretty unanimously against the suggestion of selling him. They rate him very highly, and you can see why. As I say, it's difficult to judge him last season because he was playing in a very poor team, and he's not quite ready for the Premier League. But I think the reality is, if Newcastle are looking for a third option, a young striker who's got the attributes, as I say, he's 6'4", he can run in behind, he's got a good touch, he can hold the ball up, he's very much on route to being a complete striker. And I think a lot of people look at 20 years old and think they should be a lot further on than Osula is at this point. But it's his first major full season as a top level player in a very poor team, and he held his own. I think at Newcastle it would be a very different story. He would be a good third option. I think Newcastle have got other fish to fry in the striker department. We've spoken about Jonathan David, we've spoken about Dominic Calvert-Lewin before. They do obviously have their eye on maybe a more established player, but 8 to 10 million, maybe if they can get a deal for Wilson and then bring in two strikers, Osula as a third one. As I say, in that role as a third striker, he really does sort of feel like a good option because he's got all the attributes. He's young, he wouldn't demand to play, he isn't ready to play regularly yet, but he's shown last season in flashes that he's got the ability to develop into a Premier League player, in my opinion. He can create chances for himself as well as he had to do in that team because he was playing more or less up front on his own, particularly in the first half of the season under Paul Heckingbottom. So I think that this one, if it is true, would actually make a lot more sense than people are giving it credit for. I think Newcastle fans should be quite excited about it because long term it could have real benefits, and in the immediate term he would fit that sort of archetypal young striker, hungry, good attributes, ready to prove himself, ready to step up. You're not going to get a proven striker to come in and play that role. One, because they'd cost a lot more than 8 to 10 million, and two, because they would demand a lot more playing time than if Wilson and Isak stay, they would be allowed to get. So Osula is an interesting link, and I think actually, if you look at it, it might make a lot of sense. The final thing we're going to talk about is the Japan trip. Newcastle have landed in Tokyo. Bruno Guimaraes is joining them, or has joined them, as you've seen on social media. That was sort of said to us off the record before the game, and Eddie Howe confirmed it after the game that he would be joining. Joe Willock and Sean Longstaff are expected to get some game time out there as well. We'll see how that develops. Sandro Tonali's gone, but he will only train. He won't play, obviously, because of his ban. That's more integration, that's more positivity in his sense. Obviously, he played in that friendly against Burnley that nobody knows the score of because it wasn't an official game, which was good to hear. We'll see how he gets on in terms of training. But Newcastle are ramping up and things are getting a little bit more busy. Obviously, all the delegations flown out there. There's still work in the transfer window going on. I've just been through editing the video and I've just seen it's broken on Sky and by Germany and by Keith Downey as well, that Malick Thiaw's agent has spoken out about the deal and says that Newcastle have made an inquiry, there's interest there, the talks are ongoing, but there's a gap in the valuation between Newcastle and Milan for the player. He's happy at Milan with Strahinja. Pavlovic is signed from RB Salzburg, so there's a defensive surplus potentially there at San Siro, but as it stands, he's staying at Milan because there isn't an agreement in place. There's been an inquiry, there's been talks, but there's no agreement because there's a gap in valuation. Newcastle are pushing on with this deal. It is clearly their number one priority, but at the moment there is no deal. Newcastle are looking to make a breakthrough while they're in Japan. The whole delegation's out there. Talks are still ongoing, so things are still heating up. But as it stands, Newcastle have not broken through with Malick Thiaw. There is a gap in the valuation. That's according to both Sky in Germany and Keith Downey at Sky Sports News in the UK. Thanks so much for joining me on this video. Please like, share and subscribe. Hit me in the comments below as well to give me your thoughts, but also like the video. See you next time. Cheers.